2015. It's July 24th, Friday of the CrossFit Games. The workout is Murph. It's a 1 mile run, 100 pull-ups, 200 push-ups, 300 air squats, and another 1 mile run. For the females, this was all done in a 14-pound vest. Annie Thorisdottir got a DNF on the event. Did not finish. Cara Saunders, then Cara Webb, was running in this delirious zigzag the last 40 meters and collapsed after the finish line and was taken off the field in a stretcher. These are the top 0.001% athletes. These are the top 5 in the world, and they fell apart in this workout. What happened? Was the intensity too high? Was the volume too much? No, they just overheated. And while these may be a little bit more extreme examples, it's not uncommon for an athlete's output to be limited by the cold or especially by the heat. After all, 20% of the energy you synthesize goes into output, in other words, horsepower. 80% of that energy is heat. If you haven't yet, it's time to pay attention to how temperature, thermoregulation, heat, and cold impact performance. So 2 parts for today as our outline. Part 1 is going to be more about lifestyle. So someone's circadian rhythm throughout your day. How is your temperature fluctuating? And then I also want to talk about limitations in thermoregulation. So this is a lot more heavy on the physiology side of things in this first part. And then in the second part, I want to go more towards application. So this is talking about how we can use the heat or the cold and what things can we actually take advantage of in our training. And then how can we take those things and apply it to competing? So part 1 is more physiology. Part 2 is more application. However, I truly believe that you need both to fully understand this and to be able to put it in practice the way you need to. So let's get into lifestyle. This is circadian temperature changes. A really common myth that I think a lot of people kind of hold in their belief system is that each person sort of has this set point at maybe 37 degrees Celsius. You would hear it commonly referred to as it's 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. That's just not true. The truth is each person has a slightly different average core body temperature. For example, we all know people who are cooler who tend to be more hypothyroid, and we know people who tend to be a little bit more warm most of the time or even hot a lot of the time. Right? So it's important that we understand that each person has a different core body temperature as an average across their day, and then that temperature is going to fluctuate throughout their day. So fluctuations in temperature are normal. They're actually necessary and really important to our functioning, and they're correlating extremely strongly with a person's circadian rhythm. So for those of you who aren't familiar with it, there's circadian rhythm. This is your biological clock. It's promoting sleep and wakefulness in these regular cycles. It's about 24 hours. Technically, it's a little bit over that, but viewing light during your day actually helps anchor that to that 24-hour cycle. So it's important to understand the idea of someone's circadian rhythm to really be able to understand how your temperature is fluctuating throughout your day. Just a quick little note and disclaimer here. I'm going to be taking this conversation and assuming that this is a person who is awake during the day, that this person's a diurnal individual, right? Where they're actually, not being nocturnal and awake at night, and they're not doing shift work or having to move time zones and things like that. Those are special cases, which maybe we could get into in a future topic. But for now, I'm just kind of assuming that this person's having the traditional schedule of being awake during the day and asleep at night, and having the majority of sleep or all of that sleep in a single bout. So for that person, they're going to experience a temperature minimum about 2 to 3 hours before you're actually going to be waking up, right? So in other words, that's the lowest your core temperature is going to get. And then from that point onward, up until maybe, let's say late afternoon might be average for that person, your core temperature is going to be rising. So it's rising throughout the day. And as the sun's rising, your core temperature is also rising, right? And that's kind of a good way to think about it. And then after that period of maybe late afternoon is when your core temperature is going to begin to fall again. So at this point, you're probably asking, why does this matter? This is extremely important for optimizing your sleep and your wakefulness. And you cannot be the best athlete you can be if you're not optimizing your sleep and wakefulness. So for sleep, it's important that we're actually having an athlete align their actions with the direction that you want your core temperature to be going. So for example, say you're doing an AM workout, You're working out in the morning. That's going to help raise your core temperature because you're producing work and heat along with that work. That's going to raise your core temperature, and that's going to promote alertness. And it's also going to anchor your circadian clock. In other words, it's going to basically tell your body and your biological clock that, hey, in the morning as the sun's coming up around this time, it's important that I'm awake and alert. And by creating that anchor point early in the day, it's going to allow you to actually fall asleep more efficiently at night and to stay asleep for a longer period of the time. Then for wakefulness, we could kind of correlate wakefulness to performance, right? So you're going to be very alert and awake when you need to perform. This could be cognitive tasks or it could be physical tasks. It doesn't matter if you're an athlete trying to optimize for a qualifier and get the best score on a workout at a particular time, or if you're a CEO of a major corporation and trying to make important business decisions moment over moment. It doesn't matter. Either way, we need to be at an optimal level of arousal and performance and wakefulness to perform at our best. So it's important that we're aligning our circadian clock with the times that we want to be alert. So if we think about this practically, if you have sessions throughout your day where you're working out, maybe it's just a single session, maybe you're doing double session days, you need to think about that because you want to optimize performance at those various times of day. So this actually has implications for both qualifiers and in-person events. So for a qualifier, the good thing about a qualifier is that you get to decide everything about that test, right? Besides actually what that workout is and the standards and that sort of stuff, in terms of like, you get to decide what music is on because it's your gym and you get to use your pull-up bar and chalk it the way that you like it. And you get to work out at your specific time of day that you prefer. And you can warm up as long as you like. And you can, again, you are in control of all of those different factors. So why not control the factor of the time of day that you're actually testing those workouts? Why would you not test a qualifier workout at the time of day where you feel most alert and at your best physically? We could also flip that and look at an in-person competition. If we have an in-person competition, you don't get to decide when you work out, right? You are told what time you show up and report, and maybe they start an event early and you don't get as much warm-up. Maybe you have to get bused to Aromas at 5 a.m. and do a trail run first thing in the morning, and you're not used to working out at that time. Your performance is going to degrade in all those scenarios. So for in-person competitions, if you have an idea or an inkling, or if you actually know the definitive times that you're going to be working out, you can then start to, in the weeks leading up to that time, begin to get your body used to having spikes in stress hormones and alertness and core body temperature during those times. And your body will begin to predict those rises and spikes in core temperature and the stress hormones. And then you'll actually perform better at those moments and in those periods of time because you actually prepare for them and because your body can predict them. So that's how your body temperature, your core temperature is shifting throughout your day in terms of the 24-hour cycle. So now I want to dive a little bit deeper on thermoregulation. So in other words, your body's ability to stay warm or to preserve your heat or to dump heat to the atmosphere, right? Either one of those, right? So it's trying to stay warm, trying to prevent getting too cold. So those are the two extremes I want to focus on, either overheating or freezing, hyperthermia or hypothermia, right? Too hot or too cold. We want to be like Goldilocks, somewhere right in the middle, right? That's homeostasis. That's where your body likes to be. But how do we keep ourselves there? That's thermoregulation. So as I alluded to in the intro, 80% of your metabolism is lost in heat. Only 20% is actually output. In other words, work. So in other words, as we're working, we are producing a lot of heat and we have to be able to cool ourselves off. So the majority of what I'm going to be focusing on in this thermoregulation section is really ways that humans are cooling off. And that's how I'm taking on the perspective of thermoregulation. In terms of staying warm, is pretty simple. It might not be easy, but it's simple. Like you put on layers and you do as much as possible to create a barrier between you and your environment, right? You insulate yourself with clothes. However, we experience a lot more limitations in cooling. And I think there's a lot more workout scenarios where that actually poses as a limiter for people versus being too cold. However, there certainly are those cases. But as I said, I want to focus more on the cooling aspect of things. So there are 4 ways that humans cool off. Number 1, evaporation. So this is probably the one that people most commonly think of. Like if I were to ask you like, hey, if you're working out, how do you cool off? Most people are like, well, you sweat. And that's true. Like your sweat is what's evaporating. And what's happening with evaporation is that your sweat is turning from a liquid on your skin, right? And sweat and it's water to a gas. So it's changing state as it changes state from liquid to gas, it takes a lot of energy with it. So in other words, it takes that heat along with it. So you feel evaporational cooling. There's that cooling sensation that happens. And that's a very efficient way actually of cooling you off. So I'm sure you've heard someone say, you sweat like a pig. Well, that's actually funny because swine don't actually sweat very much at all. They have very few sweat glands, which is why you see them like rolling around in the mud, because they're coating themselves in a layer of water so that they can actually take advantage of evaporational cooling more effectively. So there's your fun fact of the day. You actually don't want to sweat like a pig because you'll be very inefficient at cooling yourself off, right? If you're a heavy sweater, that's actually a good thing in terms of managing your heat and of being able to dissipate heat to your environment efficiently. So evaporation is one way that humans cool off. The second is radiation. So heat is moving, radiating from the surface of your skin into the space around it. So an example of this would be you're outside, it's a cool day, and you're standing in the sunlight. The sun warms you up. That's an example of radiation. The third one is conduction. This is a heat transfer through direct contact. An example of this would just be like putting your hands on a coffee mug, right, to warm them up. You have direct contact there. Another example would be CrossFit Games 2010 Event 9. If you go back into the archives and find that one, this was taking place in Carson, California in the StubHub Center. They had black rubber matting and the athletes were doing hand release push-ups in the sun on these mats. And it was scorching them. Like literally they were being burned. You could see the athletes shaking out their hands because the hands were so hot. And then the athletes in later heats, because the earlier ones were not, were told to like, hey, keep your shirt on. Like, don't take it off during this because you'll burn yourself. And like, I'm sure they weren't thinking about it, but they were also relatively efficiently taking on the heat from those rubber mats because they were laying on those hot rubber mats. So that would be an example of conduction. And then lastly, number 4 is convection. So if you think of a convection oven or maybe an air fryer, it's swirling around air. So convection is basically the swirling of particles. It could be wind, it could be water, but that's what's creating the cooling effect. And obviously, as most people know, like wind cools you off pretty quickly. Like there's a reason why we use wind chill, right? Because it's actually feeling like it's cooler than it is because those particles are swirling around you. However, water is actually extremely efficient at cooling you off in terms of convection. Here's a quote from the United States Search and Rescue Task Force. Quote, water conducts heat away from the body 25 times faster than air because it has a greater density and therefore a greater heat capacity. Stay dry equals stay alive, unquote. So obviously they're talking about it in a rescue situation, but it also applies to an open water swim, for example, where if you are in a cold body of water, you're going to cool off very quickly. And if you're not adjusted to that, that's going to pose as a major problem for you. Here's a quote from Danielle Brandon referring to the 2021 CrossFit Games Event 1, which was an open water swim. Quote, I had an asthma attack in the first half of the swim. I was considering pulling out, unquote. So I think there could be a number of factors that play into this, not just the cold. So for example, first of all, when you're swimming, you have to mouth breathe, right? It's really not an option to breathe through your nose, which would help humidify the air and kind of stave off some of those respiratory issues that you're having. But number 2 is like the cold is naturally sort of anxiety inducing, right? If you've ever jumped into a really cold body of water or someone like surprised you and dumped a bucket of cold water on you, it really stimulates your stress response, and that can be anxiety inducing for a lot of people. Plus, she's used to training in Vegas, so it's like another example of how if you're not used to this, right, you're not acclimatized to it, those issues with temperatures can certainly derail your performance. So those are the 4 ways that heat is leaving the body: evaporation, radiation, conduction, convection. So we need to take a step back from that, a step deeper into the physiology. So heat is leaving the body from the skin through those 4 means, but the heat is not produced in the skin, right? It has to be transferred to the skin so it can leave the body. So where's the heat actually produced? Is in the muscle. We need to get the heat from the muscle to the skin. Here's a quote by Dr. Craig Hiller. Quote, the only way heat gets out of a muscle is in the blood, unquote. So ideally, blood travels from the muscle back to the heart and then to the superficial blood vessels of the skin so that you can actually dissipate that heat through those 4 means that we already talked about to the environment. And this is the reason why people work out, they're really flush. So if someone says someone is flush or you see someone who's flush, they're red. Literally what you're seeing is the blood in their skin. So when someone's hot, they're going to dilate or open up more blood vessels that are close to the skin so that they dissipate heat faster into their environment. If they're cold, they're going to close down or constrict those blood vessels and not allow blood flow to run to the periphery out to the edges of the body. That's why you're cold if you're at a football game, sporting event, and your hands get really cold, your feet and your toes will start to get numb. It's not just your body preserving your internal organs and your viscera to try to keep yourself alive, because those are the critical parts of the body, but also because you would just dump heat so much quicker if you had that blood flow going out to the periphery. However, this idea that heat is leaving a muscle is also really important when it comes to working out, because if a muscle contracts too strongly where the heart can't push through that and continue to have steady blood flow through that muscle, then the blood is going to get trapped in the muscle. So in other words, heat is getting trapped in the muscle. So if you think about a time in a workout where you have a pump, right? Say you're doing chest over pull-ups and your biceps or your lats are filling up with blood. Blood is not being allowed to leave the muscle, so to speak, because there's too much tension and your heart can't push through that tension. Think about creating a kink in a hose where the water doesn't come out the end anymore. That's going to increase your blood pressure. It's going to trap the heat in the muscle, and it's going to prevent blood from returning to the heart. And if we have less blood returning to the heart, there's less blood that's going out of the heart. If we have less blood coming out of the heart, that means stroke volume is less. That means your output is going to be less. Your performance is going to wane. So in other words, in workouts where there's high output, there's a lot of local fatigue, right? Where a muscle's working really hard and creating strong contractions, and it's a hot environment, that's going to produce the perfect storm for overheating in a workout. So I think an Instagram post that I wrote in the fall is a really good summation of what I'm trying to get at here. Quote, Metcons provide the perfect cocktail of thermoregulatory issues and, not all that infrequently, can lead to hyperthermia. This perfect storm composes of 1. Glycolytic high-tension contractions. These strong contractions create venous occlusion, contractions that prevent blood from leaving the muscle. So heat can only get out of the muscle in the blood. 2. High systemic work rate. Aerobic power events maximize an athlete's output. This output is only 20% of an athlete's created energy. What about the other 80%? Straight up heat. 3. Thick athletes. The lower the volume to surface area ratio, the harder it is to dissipate heat. With all other factors being the same, an athlete with a BMI of 32 is likely to overheat quicker than an athlete with a BMI of 19. In the sport of fitness, you have to be strong enough to compete with the best in maximal contractions, as well as have the ability to move varying types of external loads. The result? Thick guys and gals, unquote. So I just want to revisit those 3 points. That's basically saying that Metcons are creating a perfect storm for overheating in a workout. The first was glycolytic high tension contractions, so strong contractions. 2 was a high systemic work rate. So basically you can think of producing a lot of work with big muscle groups. 3 is thick athletes, right? So people who are required to move external loads so that their BMI and just overall body mass is higher. So knowing that CrossFit is going to pose unique demands to thermoregulation, we need to do what we can to limit the likelihood that thermoregulation is going to be the thing that limits or potentially derails our performance. So in other words, we need to spend some time preparing for the various demands that could come up in competition. And again, this goes to whether you've failed to stay warm enough or you've failed to cool off effectively enough. So what can we do about it? Let's get into the practical side of things. Let's talk about heat and cold exposure. Let's talk about training. Let's talk about competing, right? The protocols that we can actually use for this. Let's start off with the heat and the cold. These would be more passive modalities, right? Where I'm saying like they're non-work based, or they could be non-work based. They don't necessarily have to be. We certainly pair the heat or the cold with activity or exercise or testing as well, but certainly they don't have to be, right? So the first category of thing that we can think about is just environmental exposures. So just as it sounds, you're exposing yourself to the environment, right? And if that environment is more extreme or intense, it's going to challenge your body's ability to thermoregulate. So an example of this would just be like, it's wintertime, you choose not to wear a coat, right? You're just exposing yourself to the environment. So the goal here is to build resiliency and limit liability. And what I mean by this is like, For example, I often will not put on the climate control in my vehicle, right? Even if it's really cold outside, say it's 18 degrees outside, I'll just choose not to put on my climate control and just kind of sit in the cold. And that's going to build resiliency, right? There's no doubt about it. That will make me more resilient to the cold over a period of time as I expose myself to that on a regular basis. However, I'm also not foolish. Like, I'm not going to not wear a coat when it's 18 degrees Fahrenheit outside and then also choose not to have a coat in my vehicle. Again, build the resiliency, but limit your liability. Like, don't wear a coat if you don't need to, but then have one available to you, right? So I have like a winter jacket in the back, I have gloves in the back and a hat so that if I, go into a snowbank over the edge, I'm not going to die because I'm too cold, right? Like that, you're being a liability to yourself at that point. Like, you are being a liability to yourself if you aren't resilient to your environment, if you aren't able to handle being in a room that's 5 degrees warmer or colder than you would prefer. It's okay being uncomfortable in terms of temperature. So some of these simple examples that I gave are like, don't turn on your climate control on your vehicle, right? If you get in and it's hot in the summertime and you just got done with the workout, just allow yourself to kind of sit in the heat or just put your windows down, right? Don't actually turn on the AC. And another really practical way to do this is just to be, let's call it cheap with your electric bill, right? So keep it cooler in winter and hotter in summer, right? So you're spending less energy to actually cool your home or heat your home. However, it also makes you more resilient, right? This doesn't have to be extreme, right? It could be like, set your AC to kick on at 74 degrees Fahrenheit and your heat to kick on at 64 degrees Fahrenheit, right? Where it's not extreme, but it's more of a swing than, the average person in America does or the average person in the world. And that's going to allow you to slowly build resiliency without even having to think about it or plan it into your day. So of those passive modalities, environmental exposure would be the first one. The second one would be sauna. And not everybody has access to this, right? Which is why I started with environmental exposures, because everyone has access to that. It's just limited by the climate that you live in. For the sauna though, there's a varying prescription, again, based on what type of sauna you have or have access to, but also just like the effect that you want and your experience level with it. So there's a lot thrown around with sauna in terms of like buzzwords like heat shock proteins and like other mechanisms as to why this is actually beneficial. But let's just take a step back and like think of this a little bit more broadly, right? If you expose yourself to a stressor on a regular basis, right? You habituate yourself to that, you're going to adapt to it over time and you're going to get better at tolerating that stressor. And actually it'll become less stressful to you. So if you expose yourself systematically to heat, which a sauna is a great way to do that, then you're going to get more and more tolerant of the heat over time. Also for heat, you could use something like hot showers or a hot tub, right? Especially if the water's moving past you, as we mentioned before, with the convection, that's going to cool you off or heat you up, in this case, a lot quicker. And again, these lengths are going to vary a lot based on the temperature that you're in. So it could be anywhere from 10 minutes to 30 plus minutes. In general, you're going to see that applications of heat last a lot longer than something like cold water immersion. So if we take this to the cold water immersion, it could be ice bath, it could be a cold shower, right? If you're actually in an ice bath or like a shower with it all the way on cold, 3 to 10 minutes is going to be plenty for that. You'll have a lot of immediate changes that occur and you might only be able to handle 30 seconds at a shot. And that's okay at the beginning. But eventually you can kind of work up to exposing yourself for 3 to 5 or 7, possibly up to 10 minutes. And definitely in all these examples, more is not better. You want to go to the effect that you need. And then once you've had the desired outcome, you need to stop, right? There's significant danger in terms of hyper or hypothermia if you go way past those thresholds, or if you haven't built up to them progressively over a period of time. So if you're someone who hasn't been in an ice bath before, 3 minutes very well could be unattainable for you at that moment. It also could be anxiety inducing, right? If you're someone who's prone to anxiety attacks, I wouldn't just recommend jumping into an ice bath. However, what I would do is use the cold as a tool to help you learn to control your stress response, to control your breathing, and to control ultimately your anxiety and the response to that stressor. If you want to learn more about how to use the cold as a tool to help own your anxiety, so to speak, I actually wrote an article on this called How Cold Showers Can End Your Anxiety and Improve Your Fitness, which is a very clickbait title, but I think it's accurate and does describe what happens for a lot of people. I'll link to that in the show notes, zorfitness.com/podcast/059. Another useful resource would be to check out my podcast on shift state. That was number 008 of the podcast. That would be another one if you're interested and want more on how to control your stress response and how to improve your recovery. That would definitely be a good episode to check out. So that was a very brief overview of the heat and the cold. I want to move on to training, right? I understand that I could go much deeper into any one of these topics, but I kind of want to keep moving here. If you're someone who's listening and you're like, oh man, I wish you would have went deeper on this, let me know. Maybe I'll do an episode on it in the future. Be sure to reach out to me. I'm on Instagram at ZorFitness. And then also you can just email me, ben@zorfitness.com. So let's move on to training best practices. So talking about training sessions, right? Not competing, we're talking about training. 3 things that I would consider to be training best practices as they relate to temperature and thermoregulation. The first is to use a thermogenic warm-up, which is like saying a warm-up. Basically, it's the aspect of your warm-up or your prep work that's actually raising your body temperature. This does not need to be complicated. It could be as simple as 5 minutes on the assault bike at an easy conversational pace. 1K row at a ramping pace, making sure you start very easy and you only increase every 200 meters, for example. So these are very simple, relatively short, largely aerobic warm-ups. And I always prefer to have my athletes and myself do them on the ergs. So 3 benefits of a thermogenic warm-up. The first is blood flow. So obviously as you increase your work rate, blood vessels are going to dilate, you're going to get more blood flow to those areas. But the other thing is CO2, carbon dioxide, which is a byproduct of metabolism, is going to cause vasodilation. So basically doing things that are slightly fatiguing actually allow you to open up to be able to express better capacity. And one of those ways is through vasodilation. Another one is force production. So as you raise your body temperature, this thermoregulatory warm-up, your muscle contractility will improve. So your muscles can actually contract stronger at a certain temperature. So when you're cold, your muscles actually don't contract as hard as when you're warm. Obviously, like most things in the body, this has a zone, right? You want to be within a certain zone that's actually going to allow for that ideal muscle contractility. Too cool or too hot is going to prevent ideal contraction of a muscle. And then the third thing a thermogenic warm-up is going to improve is your positions. So your range of motion, right? Your mobility improves as you get warm. And your elasticity, right? So think about like a rubber band, right? You're going to be crisper, you're going to be more elastic and more springy once you have a better warm-up under your belt. Our second training best practice is rehearsal and rest. So say we've taken someone through a thermogenic warm-up. They've done some additional prep work to prepare their positions and their movements. Now comes time for the rehearsal. So the rehearsal is the specific prep that mimics the movements, the rep schemes, and the paces of the test that's going to be following it. So let's just take the example of Mary. Mary's the test. It's a 15-minute AMRAP of 5 strict handstand push-ups, 10 pistols, and 15 pull-ups. What would be a rehearsal that would work well for something like Mary? Again, so you want to mimic the movements, the rep schemes, the paces that you're going to be doing. It could be something as simple as this, right? You're going to take a 2-minute air bike at a ramping pace. All that is just to get your heart rate up, get your breathing up a little bit. So it feels a little bit more like what it's actually going to feel like when you're doing the workout. Immediately into 2 rounds at workout pace, 3 strict handstand push-ups, 6 pistols, 9 pull-ups. So we cut back the reps a little bit, but that allows us to accumulate 2 rounds. And the other good thing about having that air bike as sort of a buy into that rehearsal is that it prevents you just from doing so many reps of the movements that you're going to see in the test. Again, it's important that you're doing those movements, those strict handstand push-ups, pistols, pull-ups. However, if you do too much in your rehearsal, that's going to limit your ability to be able to express well when you actually get to the test. So do your rehearsal, something similar to that. It could be as simple as just doing a few of the movements in the order that they come up in relatively small chunks. And then you're going to rest. So again, it's rehearsal and rest. So the rest is going to be a few minutes, basically enough time, adequate time for your heart rate, your core temperature to get back towards an optimal level for you to actually start the test and allow your system to remove a lot of those metabolic waste, basically like the clearing of fatigue. So practically this could be like, wait until you feel really good to do your test. And likely this will probably be anywhere in the range of like 4 to 6 minutes, right? 5 minutes is sort of a good rule of thumb of like, I've done my rehearsal, I'm now going to be resting, and then I'll start the test. So go to the bathroom, get a little bit of fluids in you, get all the gear that you need, make sure the clock's prepped, all that stuff. And that can be part of your rest time as well. So kind of have that built in before you actually do your test. And then our third best practice is a flush cool down. So let's go through a sample protocol. Let's say this is post Mary, that test. Again, let's keep it very simple. This is 5 to 10 minutes on an air bike at a recovery pace, right? So very easy. You're probably below 50 RPMs on the air bike. It's very easy. I want you returning back to nasal breathing as quickly as you can, helping yourself cool down, shifting state back to more of a, I guess you could call it like a rest and digest type state, right? You're more parasympathetic. And as you're producing these light contractions as you're on the air bike, that's helping to flush, right? Basically clear out all the metabolites out of your muscles. So it's pushing blood through the muscles that have been working, and it's helping clear the fatigue. And it's also carrying that blood that's carrying all that heat out of the muscle so it can, again, go to the surface of your skin and actually cool yourself off. So it's often called a cool down. Like your body is going to naturally cool yourself down, right? So it's not like you are cooling yourself down by doing more aerobic work. Rather, I would say it's more of a flushing of all the systems. So it's allowing you to clear that fatigue a little bit more rapidly than you would if you were just to go and sit down, right? It's also going to promote you to actually feel better when you go to get up again, because not all of those metabolites are being trapped in your muscle. And then after that air bike, you go into 3 rounds of 1 minute foam rolling your lats because you just did a bunch of pull-ups, and 1 minute of a couch stretch per leg, kind of opening up your hip anterior structures because you just did a bunch of pistols. So those are the 3 best practices. 1 is to use a thermogenic warm-up. 2, rehearsal and rest. 3 is a flush cool down. So what does that sound like? That sounds like just good training, right? Like this is nothing new. It should be nothing new to you. Like I hope most people are already doing a warm-up of some kind, even if they didn't know if it was raising their body temperature and etc. And I hope most people are already doing the movements that they're gonna do in the workout before they actually get to that workout. And I hope most people don't just walk out the door after they finish their AMRAP, right? I hope they actually do something to continue to move a little bit and to slowly take that off ramp off the highway and don't just slam on the brakes. So again, this is nothing new. This is the best practices that you already have and the hygiene that you already have around your training times. And it's important that we just extend that to understanding how temperature is involved in that process. And I also want to make a note of what this isn't. Right? This isn't making yourself extra cold or extra hot while you're working out. And while there are certainly circumstances where I think that kind of thing can be helpful and actually makes sense, in general, that's just going to put a governor on your workout. Like it's going to put a cap. It's going to slow you down. And ultimately, like that's not how you get more fit, is by slowing yourself down. So you want to do what you can to remove those bottlenecks so that you can actually perform better in your training. And that way, when you go to compete, you're at a higher fitness level and you can express better. Now, finally, let's talk about competing. Competing is about optimizing. It's about making things as easy as possible so that you can perform at your best. You have the best outcome, right? You are optimizing for the outcome versus the goal of training, which is to adapt, right? The goal is to drive change in your physiology, whereas with competing, you want the best score. And those are not always the same thing. It's important that you understand the difference between optimizing and adapting. Goal for competing is to make things as easy as possible for yourself. So let's talk about optimizing temperature for competing. The first thing would be acclimatization, right? Which is a fancy way of you getting used to a new climate, you getting adjusted to it. This process generally takes about 14 days. That's kind of generally agreed upon. So let's say you're going to compete in Madison, right? And you're from a much colder climate. Then you need to get adjusted to that heat. Right? The easiest thing that you could do would actually be to travel to that location early enough where you can actually adjust to that climate and that time zone. So if you have to compete in Texas at the Rogue Invitational, travel there 10, 14 days early, get used to that environment, kind of hang out there, right? Get used to the time zone, make sure you're waking up the right time of day to get yourself all adjusted so that you feel good when the time to compete actually rolls around. Obviously, this isn't always feasible, and the logistics and realities of what it would take to arrive at a competition that is not your home 14 days early is not always super feasible. Like you have to then spend like 2+ weeks in a hotel room, which is a lot of money. But if you're a games athlete and you could potentially win, $250,000 or more, it becomes necessary to do those sorts of things. But even if you're someone who can't travel there early or chooses not to do that, there's still a lot of things that you can do to get yourself acclimatized to the climate that you're going to be going to. So basically, this comes down to mimicking the conditions that you expect to compete in while you are training. So, for example, if you plan to compete in the heat, like if you're going to Texas, like the example I used, what things can you do to optimize and prepare yourself to compete in that heat? First thing you can do is just work out midday, right? In the heat of the day. Work out in your current climate where it is hottest. So basically midday when the sun is highest, that's when you want to be working out. You can do simple things like don't turn on a fan, right? Wear an extra layer, like put on thermal tights or things like that are going to trap the heat and not allow you to cool off as efficiently. Or you can do things outside of your session like supplementing with a sauna or a hot tub. If you plan to compete in the cold or cooler environment, things that would be helpful, I would consider doing bouts of cold water immersion. So this could be actually getting into like an ice bath, or it could just be taking cold showers or cool showers, right? They don't have to be freezing cold, and staying in that for a period of time until you're uncomfortable and then staying in just a little bit longer. And then I would also say like work out when it is the coolest, right? So when the sun is low in the sky, and then do anything you can to cool yourself off. So get some industrial fans, right? Even if it's a cool environment, make yourself as cold as you can while you're working out so that you can get adjusted to that. And overall, I would say it's easier to prepare for competing in the cold than it is competing in the heat, because you can always add on more layers, right? And that's the simple thing with competing, unless you have a uniform that you're not allowed to change, is that you can always add on more layers. And as I said, probably the best thing would just be going and actually getting yourself into that environment if you can. So let's say you actually are at this competition now. This is the day before the competition. What things can we do to optimize for this environment in terms of temperature? One would just be, as you're packing your backpack, is to prepare a lot of clothes options, right? So clothing. Think about the different layer combinations that you could be wearing depending on the temperature. And also, as you actually get into workouts, how you could either shed layers or add layers on based on how the temperature could be changing on that given day. So, pack extra pairs of socks, different types of socks, different materials. You get hot hands, like those packets that are, chemicals that, help warm up your hands, that people use at like football games and that sort of thing. And those are all more cold climate things. If it's a hot climate, definitely take extra changes of t-shirts, shorts, undergarments, because when they're sweaty, you want to be able to change them. We'll get into more on that later. Other things for the day before competing is to prepare hot and cold beverages based on if you're in hot conditions or cold conditions. So if you're in hot conditions, you generally want more cold things. So things like smoothies with frozen fruits, right? Any sort of frozen drink or really cold drink that was been like a cooler, right? So bring like a cooler of ice or a chest of ice that you can put things in to keep them cold. Like frozen bananas that are cut up, frozen grapes. Fruit's always a great option because there's a lot of carbs. Any cold snack that is more carb-based is going to be a great option for when you're actually competing the day of. And these are things to prepare the day before. If you're in cold conditions, things that are hot are obviously going to be helpful to keep you warm. Soups, stews, hot tea or coffee, right? In a thermos or some sort of container that it's actually going to preserve the heat throughout the entirety of that day. So that's the big thing, is like, even if you are not able to have access to like a fridge or a microwave, it's important that you still can have hot food on a cold day or cold food on a hot day. These are things that you need to think about and prepare ahead of time. If you do have access to a microwave or to, a coffee maker, that sort of stuff, because you're at your home gym, or you just because you can just go back to your hotel room between events or whatever the case may be, or you just go out and get some hot food, then you have a little bit more options, but certainly opt for easily digestible hot or warm foods. While you're actually competing, things you can do to optimize your temperature. Take advantage of pre-cooling if you're able to. Basically, pre-cooling means, just as it sounds, you're going into a cool environment before you actually compete in a hot environment. So, again, if we're just being practical about this, spend as much time in an air-conditioned location prior to your event as possible. And then only leave that right beforehand, or as the event team or whoever dictates to you that you have to be able to leave. But staying as long as you can in a cool environment is going to help delay the onset of that increase in core temperature that's going to be performance draining. Again, another common myth that I think a lot of people subscribe to is that if you want to perform well in a hot environment, you need to go outside and get used to that, so to speak, like acclimatizing, but rather than like 14 days before, like 30 minutes before. Again, that is not backed by the research at all. You want to spend time in a cool environment. Like, you still want to do a warm up, but get into a cool environment as you're doing your warm up and making sure your body temperature isn't climbing beyond what it needs to be prepped for those movements. Then while you're actually competing, doing anything that you can to position yourself like physically in space so that you're cooled off. So for example, if you can choose your lane and it's like a first come, first serve sort of thing, go in the shade if that's an option, or to go in front of a fan or in a corridor where there's more breeze, right? There's a lot of different options. And if you understand mechanisms that we went over earlier and how you actually cool off, you can think about, where can I position myself and what things can I do to help optimize my cooling during the actual event? And then the last thing would just be to wear light colors. If you were in the sun, you are going to absorb more heat if you are in dark colors. So wear white or very light colors so that more is reflected off that and you absorb less of that heat. And then also to wear breathable materials, right? Which is going to allow for more evaporational cooling to take place. And then lastly, between events. So after each event, you want to cool off as quickly as you can, right? That might involve getting into a cool body of water. It doesn't need to be freezing cold. It could just be putting your hands on something that is cool. Again, not super cold because that'll actually constrict the blood vessels and not allow blood to continue to move through them. And if blood's not moving through them, then you're not actually cooling your blood. But something that is cool, right? That will help you cool off. And then also just to get out of the elements. So get into an air conditioned facility, get out of the sun if you're able to, get out of the noise too. This is not really related to temperature, but it's draining if you're in an environment where you hear the announcer the entire time or you hear a crowd of people, especially if there's a lot of people. That is a lot of energy. It's a lot of noise. It can be draining for people, especially who spend a lot of time training alone in their garage or at their gym, right? So understanding that that can be draining, the sun can be draining, noise can be draining, just being in a temperature that's ambient, that's hot, or that's cold can be draining. Get out of the elements. Lastly, I would say towel off and change clothes. So when you're sweating, don't let that sweat dry on you. Even though you're really hot in the moment, it's easy to just let that go. Once you're cooled off, obviously if you're sweating, you can just let yourself sweat. But after you're done sweating, tie yourself off before it actually dries and then change into fresh clothes. That's going to allow your body to maintain homeostasis of core temperature and prevent big shifts and swings in your core temperature. Now, I hope you feel more equipped with how to overcome any extreme temperature that may get thrown at you. And ultimately, I hope that you have a better understanding of how temperature, thermoregulation, heat, and cold impact performance.